Through the 1930s to 90 years later today, the perception of horror and how horror is represented has drastically changed. In the 1930s, horror was depicted as the supernatural, mythical beasts and ancient folklore that haunted forests, mountains, and loomed over the seas. Creatures like the Kraken, the Cthulhu, and the nine-tailed fox were legends that were prominent in different cultures and stories. This sort of horror was directly linked to how movies like Dracula were produced and revolved around this otherness that was not human nature but supernatural. Then came the 1980s and the 1990s, where slasher horror films with blood, flesh, and horrific scenes were trending and what was considered horror for the time. Movies such as Friday the 13th, Chainsaw Texas Massacre, and Child's Play are iconic slasher films that depicted violent actions and extremely disturbing scenes that served as a shock factor rather than psychologically terrifying the audience. The movies were intentionally made to distress the audience rather than scare the audience. Now, in today's horror films, it is a mix of slasher, supernatural, and psychological factors that the audience today perceive as horror films. Movies such as Midsummer, Incantation, and Hereditary aim to mentally disturb the audience through symbols, mental vulnerabilities, and internal paranoia that disturb the audience's perception of reality. This sort of horror makes us doubt our senses, gaslight ourselves, and gives us a sense of uncanny even in the real world. In 1931, one of the most groundbreaking horror films that shapes today's world of horror was released. Frankenstein introduced costumes with heavy brutalist makeup, with his flat-headed design and sunken eyes. The rod sticking out of his neck was ghoulish and otherworldly. The film aimed to target educated adults interested in gothic horrors, romantic literature, and science, which was new and emerging at the time. Frankenstein himself is a big, monstrous monster standing 8 feet tall that is a wretched, sympathetic being representing the dangers of unchecked scientific ambitions, abandonment, and longing for companionship. The film itself is a convention for gothic themes and horror elements with deep shadows, extreme emotional states, and a ruined nature. Overall, this film cemented the mad scientist trope, which defined the crazy madman willing to go beyond the limits and test the human body to its maximum capabilities. It was the real first big step moving away from the supernatural horror and allowing the idea that the human nature can be innately horrifying, and it shifted the narrative toward human experimentation and body augmentation, which explored the concept of blood, flesh, and squeezy images and feelings. As the 70s came, the horror industry moved away from the supernatural horrors and veered towards humans, flesh, and blood. Naturally, slasher movies also started becoming trending. But it wasn't a coincidence that slasher movies started becoming more popular. It was a direct mirroring of the tumultuous American history at the time. The Vietnam War had just ended, and its horrors simply did not end in Vietnam but carried over to America. Teenagers that were growing up in this era were anxious, uncertain, and hopeless because of the outlook of the future and the countless bloodshed and lives lost they have seen broadcasted on television at the time. Movie directors took advantage of this fear and uncertainty and brought it to a new level. Movies of the last decade were less violent and focused more on themes and horrors, while movies of the 70s were violent, depraved of emotions, and bloody. It had a greater focus on real-life consequences and horrors rather than the supernatural, which simply faded out of view. People were used to violence, and the only way to capture their attention was with more violence. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was one of the most violent and visceral movies to come out at the time. With a low budget and realistic settings, the shocking and violent acts of the masked man, rather than a supernatural, was pure greedy and somewhat realistic. What defined the Chainsaw Massacre was the leather mask. The coat of costumes helped build suspense and mystery around who this terrifying killer was and made the audience go crazy over him. This representation of a masked, mysterious, unstoppable killer became the trademark of all slasher films to come and helped define what a slasher really is. Now comes the scariest subgenre of horror. Driving away from the old 70s slasher films and moving into the modern day, horror movies have become slow and cathartic. This genre of horror is aimed towards thrill seekers, typically aged around 15 to 35 years of age. Most horror movies rely on tension and built up suspense over time to release in a single shock scene to release all the tension by having a jump scare or by showing you the monster. But in psychological horror, there is no such thing. In the 2014 film, The Babadook, there isn't a single jump scare, but rather nothing happens. The tension of nothing happening never leaves and keeps the audience on their toes into the very end. People anticipate a jump scare whenever nothing happens, so they can reset, but in the Babadook, there is a never sigh of relief. This requires the directors to take extra skill in story writing and atmosphere setting. In Babadook's house, we never see any sort of light, but rather grayish and black undertones. We never actually see the monster itself, but the vibe that it creates and insinuates. In a movie where practically nothing happens, it forces the audience to connect with the character and simply watch them live their life. This is psychologically brain clustering because you never actually know what is going to happen and you can never anticipate it. One of the best scenes in the Babadook showcases exactly that. A living room shot where the mother is simply picking up the phone and going out of view. It's an unfocused shot of nothing, and that is exactly why it is unnerving. The setting of the movie becomes its own character and plays mind games with you and forces you to wonder what is going to happen. Is there going to be a jump scare? And simply messes with your own perception of the movie and the real life world. This is what makes it cringe and fear what is going to happen next when there's nothing that is going to happen next. This is where the psychological comes from in psychological horror films. Overall, the horror of psychological horror is not decided by the movie but by you. What you see, what you hear, what you interpret, and what you feel is all dictated by you and yourself. It is all simply in your head, and the filmmakers simply do not determine what is scary to you. In general, horror is a versatile genre that encompasses all aspects of real life and fiction, going from supernatural cosmic horror to real life masked human killers and finally horror that is in your mind. Horror is subjective, and what may scare you may simply just feel like a tickle to another person. That is why horror has changed over time to accommodate real world problems, changing times, and changing audiences.